Prequels always struggle to get traction with the original audience. People usually chalk it up to poor acting, poor writing, or an uninspired storyline. And many say that it's because you know how things will end up, so there's no real tension. But I think it goes deeper than that. There are definite features of prequels that often make people instinctively dislike them. But are they really the prequels' fault? Or are we watching them in the wrong way? Let's dive in and find out. When people watch prequels, the reaction is a natural one. You've already grown accustomed to the original story and characters. If you care to watch the prequels, you're probably already heavily invested in the original. Prequels often get a bad rep, and it's largely undeserved. I think one of the biggest problems with prequels isn't the films themselves, or even in the audience's taste, but rather in the audience expectations. Watching a prequel series properly takes effort, especially if the prequels span multiple movies or shows, and that's something people don't usually like. There's a trend of hating prequels in the beginning, but loving them, or at least tolerating them, by the end. This is easy enough for standalone prequels, like The Temple of Doom or Monsters University, because no matter how much trepidation the audience may have at the start, by the end of the film you can be assured that they'll connect the characters on screen with the original story they already love. But what about longer form prequels? In that case, it's usually the final movie or final season that people love after a rocky beginning. For example, the general consensus online is that the Star Trek prequel Enterprise is mostly just weak fluff, but that the final season is its best. You see this in the infamous Star Wars prequels too, where many people hated the start but warmed up to it by the final film, Revenge of the Sith. This even happened with spin-off prequel TV shows like The Clone Wars, where again, fan reception was cold at first but significantly warmed up by the final season. But it doesn't have to be this way. I think I know why it is though. Watching a prequel through the eyes of someone who likes the original guides your focus throughout the movie. It's natural to search for the connections and the inconsistencies, watching it to see how well it will work its way into the original, and if it will manage to do that in an effective way that actually brings something new. And that's an okay way to watch prequels, but it's not the best way. To learn the best way, you have to think chronologically. In my experience, I'd say that the best way to watch or read any story with prequels is in chronological order, or at least thinking of the prequels as their own unique story, which will maybe eventually lead into the originals. People who love the originals tend to disagree with this, saying that doing it that way would ruin the magic and mystery of the original films or books or series, and that it wouldn't make sense anyway because you wouldn't understand all the references in the prequels. They assume that their experience with the media was best because it was good for them, but there's actually a better way. Watching a prequel first without much knowledge of the original series actually makes the story much more interesting. Every reference becomes foreshadowing. Every surprise connection to the original story makes for a shocking plot twist, and every character's arc is seen in real time through the eyes of the characters for greater emotional impact and depth. And there are plenty of chances for dramatic irony, where the viewer knows something from the prequels that the main characters didn't yet realize in the original. Let me give a recent example from my own experience. I've never been a Star Trek fan. I didn't know much about it, and the only part I'd ever seen was some of the J.J. Abrams reboot, but in quarantine this year I figured I'd give it a try. Rather than watch only the shows with the most fans, or the shows in release order, I decided to try watching them in chronological order, and that's been a great decision. Based on a quick skimming of the internet, it seems that the chronologically first series, Enterprise, is one of the least popular among fans, with a common criticism being that it doesn't even start to feel like Star Trek until the final season. But that's not a problem for me going in fresh. To me, everything in the show is new and interesting as its own storyline. I'm sure that things will branch off into the other series as I get further on, but from now, I'm just able to fully enjoy the story's simple beginning with no idea where it will go and no idea what it will eventually connect to. I don't have any concern about inconsistency with the older series because I trust that as I get closer to the end of the prequels, it will naturally flow into the original story one way or another. and it might feel like a sharp turn to anyone already familiar with it, but to me it will be a natural extension of the story I've already been watching. My favorite example of this effect was when I showed my wife Star Wars for the first time. She had no knowledge of the story, and she didn't know anything beyond having seen the merchandise around stores. Against the internet's advice, I showed her the movies in chronological order. And again, that was the best decision, and something that I highly recommend. When people hear this, their first thought is always something along the lines of, spoilers for Star Wars here if you want to skip ahead. Won't that ruin the surprise that Darth Vader is Luke's father? Why would you take away such a great moment from cinema? But this actually worked out much better than you'd expect, and in general my wife had a really unique, amazing experience with it compared to most people because she got to watch them in chronological order for the first time. From predicting that Obi-Wan would become the villain, to being blindsided by the sweet young Anakin's turn to the dark side, to having a unique attachment to Vader through the original films, it gave her an entirely unique perspective that made a lot more depth for the story. There's only one scene that it really caused problems for, and that scene is pretty awkward to watch regardless of what order you watch the movies in first. But to answer that question about ruining the "I am your father" surprise, yes it did. But not in the way you would think. She went into that scene knowing that Vader was Luke's father, so that shocking twist was gone. But it was replaced with something arguably better. Throughout the entire battle between Luke and Vader, she was on the edge of her seat, worried about them hurting each other since she knew that they were family. And when we finally got to that climactic moment, she felt rushing catharsis to see Luke finally find out what she had known all along. It just added so much depth and heart to the experience, and I think that's the real power of prequels. For new fans just experiencing the story for the first time, prequels can add so much depth to the character development and build such a strong connection by the time you get to the original story. Imagine what it would be like to watch Raiders of the Lost Ark for the first time, already knowing Indy's history as a rough and tumble adventurer outlaw. Imagine seeing Monsters, Inc. for the first time, after having just watched Mike and Sully develop their deep bond through university antics. Imagine seeing a Star Trek transporter used to beam someone up for the first time as a cool surprise, rather than just some reference to an original show. Imagine your first time watching Vader turn on the Emperor after having just seen his entire rise and fall before that. Prequels aren't always just reference-filled cash grabs that don't live up to the originals. They're unique stories of their own that tie back into the original stories to create a deeper experience for every future viewer. That's something that I think is pretty special, but I want to hear your thoughts. What are your favorite or least favorite prequel movies and shows? Have you ever gotten to experience anything like what I talked about in this video? If you have, comment below, and thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new, and I hope to see you again next time.